late 1990s and early 2000s, Nokia was just this absolutely untouchable titan of the tech world. They were selling literally hundreds of millions of mobile phones, and they'd optimized their supply chain to this absolute perfection. I mean, they were basically printing money. And then a decade later, that entire mobile phone business was just completely obliterated. It's a spectacular cautionary tale, honestly. And the question is, how can we understand this? Welcome back to the Strategy Show, the podcast that connects real-world business events with the strategy concepts that help us to understand them. I'm Ben Dixon-Green, and today our mission is how to explore a very common model to help businesses understand their products and how to manage them, which is the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG Growth Share Matrix. Please drop me a follow and feel free to add a comment to let me know your thoughts on the show. So, the BCG Matrix, it's something that if you've done any business strategy training at all, you'll have heard of. At its core, it's just this simple 4-square grid that was created by a management consultant called Bruce Henderson back in 1970. And the matrix classifies every product that a business might create into just 4 categories: cash cows, dogs, stars, and question marks. Now, despite sounding like something out of a children's book, it fundamentally revolutionized how kind of massive conglomerate businesses operate and how they allocate their cash. So our mission for this episode is to figure out the underlying mechanics of how this very simple grid took over the corporate world. We'll have a look at why it eventually faced a fairly brutal backlash. But most importantly, we're going to look at whether a strategy tool from the disco era can actually help us make sense of the modern world. But, before we can judge if the matrix actually works today, we really have to have a look at how the underlying grid actually works. Because identifying a product as a cash cow or a dog is a completely useless labeling exercise unless you understand the forces that create those labels in the first place. So, first up, how exactly is this grid built? Well, it basically condenses the whole world of corporate complexity down into just 2 dimensions. You have an x-axis and a y-axis. Now, let's start with the x-axis. This measures relative market share. Now, this isn't just about bragging rights, being the biggest player in the room. The relative market share is fundamentally a measure of a product's profitability. Now, how does having a bigger market share automatically make you more profitable? Well, think about the very first time you put together a piece of flat pack furniture. It probably took you 3 hours, you installed one of the shelves backwards and you lost some of the screws, certainly if you're anything like me. But if you had to build that exact same bookshelf, God forbid, 100 times, by the 100th time, you'd be flying through it in 20 minutes because you've figured out the shortcuts, you've memorized the instructions. There's something we call the experience curve. And actually, it's the same for a company. The more units a company produces, the better and faster they get at making the product. And they achieve economies of scale. So if you have a massive market share relative to your competitors, you're producing way more units than they are. And because of that experience curve, and because of your strong economies of scale, your cost to produce each unit just plummets. Which means you can make it cheaper than the other guy, so your profit margins explode. So high market share tends to equal pretty strong generation of profit and cash. So that's one axis in the BCG matrix. Now, for the vertical y-axis, this one measures market growth rate. So this represents, if you like, the attractiveness of the market itself. Is this a booming brand new industry, or is it a stagnant legacy industry? High growth markets are chaotic. They require kind of a massive continuous influx of cash just to keep up with the expansion. Because if it's a rapidly growing industry, you need to build new factories. You need to run massive ad campaigns. You have to fight off new competitors, that kind of thing. You're constantly trying to steal a slice of an expanding pie. But stagnant, low growth markets, well, they don't require that cash drain because the dust's already settled. Everyone knows who the winners and losers are. There's no big kind of competition for the market anymore. Okay, let's try and ground this theoretical grid in reality. We're going to use Apple's products to illustrate the 4 quadrants. Let's look at our first quadrant: high market share, high market growth. These are what we call the stars. For Apple, the star could currently be seen as the iPhone. It commands a very large share of the market that, at least for a long time, was growing really rapidly. Now, stars sound amazing. You're dominating in this really exciting, fast growth market. But there's a catch with stars. Because the market's so competitive and fast moving, Apple has to constantly pour billions of dollars into research, development, and marketing every single year just to try and maintain that lead. That's why it constantly brings out updated models and changes to its operating system. So stars like the iPhone generate a lot of cash, but they also consume a massive amount of cash to stay as market leaders and maintain their position. Now, it's worth remembering that, of course, markets do eventually mature. The smartphone market isn't expanding exponentially anymore. So if we maintain our high market share, eventually the star will drop down into the bottom left quadrant of the BCG matrix, which is where we have high market share, but the market is now only growing slowly, so we have low market growth. What we've arrived at here is a cash cow. Now, the cash cow, as it sounds, is kind of the dream scenario. For Apple, think of the MacBook or the iMac. The laptop market is mature. It's not exploding with new untapped demographics, but Apple still holds a fiercely loyal user base and a massive share of the premium tier end of the market. And because the market isn't growing hugely, they don't have to reinvent the wheel or build 5 new factories every year. Even when they release new laptops like the MacBook Neo, they're still just tinkering with the core product they already have. The MacBook range brings in steady, highly reliable revenue with actually relatively low ongoing investment. Now that brings us on to the more difficult side of the matrix, the top right quadrant. So low market share, high market growth. These are called the question marks, or as the original 1970s literature called them, the problem children, which I think is a far more fun name. For Apple today, the Vision Pro headset would be a classic question mark. The augmented and virtual reality market is projected to be a high growth frontier. That's why everyone's putting so much money into it. But right now, Apple's actual market share is incredibly small, and the product is wildly expensive and actually rather risky. It's going to require a massive amount of cash to develop it. Now, it could eventually conquer the market and become a star, or it could completely flop and drain billions from Apple. So it's that question mark on the balance sheet at the moment. Now that leaves us with the final quadrant, bottom right, low market share, low market growth, the dogs. Now in the Apple ecosystem, a classic dog was probably the iPod in its final years before they discontinued it. The market for dedicated MP3 players was dead. It had basically been cannibalized by smartphones. And even within that shrinking market, standalone music player sales were dwindling. The iPod was obsolete, it generated very little cash, and it offered absolutely zero growth potential. Now, when you step back and look at the whole board, managing a business portfolio using this matrix is incredibly similar to how you should manage a personal investment portfolio. It's all about the flow of cash and balancing risk. And this is a crucial point for anyone listening. Even if you don't run a corporation, think about your own investments or your own side projects, if you have any. You wouldn't want a pension or an investment fund that was made up entirely of highly volatile crypto startups. Those are your question marks. Yeah, they might earn you a lot of money, but you might also go bankrupt. You need some of those question marks mixed in with reliable, steady investments, your cash cows, to spread the risk of your portfolio. You take some guaranteed dividends from those safe investments and you use it to fund a bit of risky investment that might become tomorrow's big winners. The BCG matrix maps that life cycle to a business setting. The cash cows generate the excess capital, You siphon that bit of that capital off and you feed it to the stars to try and maintain their dominance. And you also feed it to a select few question marks, hoping the injection of cash kind of pushes up their market share, so eventually they turn into stars as well. Now, obviously that's the sensible principle. The BCG takes this idea and very rigidly defines how you therefore treat each product in each quadrant. So if you have a star, the strategy should always be aggressive investment. You have a lead, you have to spend whatever it takes to hold that lead. So remember, stars have got they've got a market lead, but they have them in a very, very fast moving industry. So you have to keep pumping money in, like we said, to try and maintain that position. For a cash cow, the strategy is to harvest. Or another way to think about it, if it's a cow, you milk it for all the profit it's worth. You minimize further development, you slash marketing budgets, and you just extract the maximum profit margins possible. Because remember, you're a dominant player in a slow market. So because the market is slow, you don't have to invest lots of cash to fend off new entrants. For question marks, it's a double or quit scenario. You either commit to a big influx of cash to try and buy market share and grow it to become a star, or you pull the plug completely. And finally, for the dogs, the traditional advice is actually kind of ruthless. You divest or you liquidate. Kill the dog, sell it off or shut it down. Now, I really want to push back on this because that feels wildly short-sighted. Are we really saying that a business should eliminate every single product that has low market share in a slow market? I mean, what if you have a small, loyal group of customers who absolutely rely on that product? Sending every dog to be put down is a massive strategic error because there are actually 4 distinct subcategories of dogs. The first is the infant. These are a kind of brand new products in very early development. On a spreadsheet, they look exactly like a dog because they haven't captured market share yet, so they've got low market share, but the market itself also may not have officially taken off yet, so it might be a new market that's only growing slowly at the moment. But killing off an infant product just because its metrics are currently low destroys your future pipeline. You're not going to have any products to launch if you kill them all off before they become big. You have to give the products time to walk before they can run. The second type of dog product is what we call the war horse. This is a former cash cow that's kind of aged out of its prime. The market is less attractive, it's shrinking, the product's market share is dropping, but it still makes a small, predictable profit. You can see this sort of thing happening perfectly in the software world. There's always some kind of ancient, clunky piece of legacy software that a few major enterprise clients absolutely refuse to upgrade from. It costs the developer nothing to keep the servers on, and those stubborn clients keep paying the licensing fee. You don't kill a warhorse if it's feeding itself. That this might be a dog product, but it's actually still earning you money. So what's the point of killing it off? Then you have the cash dog. It's kind of a similar concept. It's got a low share in a mature market, but through efficiencies or being kind of targeted to a very specific niche of people, it still generates positive cash flow. And there are also actually times when a cash dog is necessary to complete a product line, like home computer printers. Home computer printers is a very competitive market with lots of players, very low margins, and actually relatively little growth nowadays. You might be a company with a very low market share, but you'd still want to sell those home printers, even if that looks like a classic dog product. Why? The answer is because those printers support other products that you sell, specifically the high margin printer ink. This can be more valuable per milliliter than champagne. So you keep the dog product because it supports other more valuable products in your portfolio. So the only dog you actually put down is the fourth type, which is sometimes nicknamed the dodo. These are the true cash draining, hopeless products that have no strategic value, they don't benefit the rest of your portfolio, and they have negative cash flows. Those are the ones that you eliminate. Now that extra depth really changes how you view the whole matrix. But I hope you see that how beautifully simple that framework is, because the majesty of the BCG matrix is that it lets you take your whole complex business, map it on four squares, and then just gives you a set of instructions. It completely explains, hopefully to you, why this model took over the world. It was incredibly seductive. But it also sets the stage for what became a massive backlash. If it was this helpful, why did management theorists back in the 1980s start ripping it to pieces? Well, to understand the backlash, you've got to picture the 1970s corporate world. This was the golden era of the sprawling conglomerate. You had massive holding companies that owned wildly unrelated businesses all under one roof. So a single CEO might be in charge of a jet engine manufacturer, a chain of fast food restaurants, a light bulb factory, and a television network. How does one human brain possibly process the resource allocation for jet engines and French fries at the same time? Well, they don't. The sheer volume of data was paralyzing. So in the 1970s, executives were just drowning in complexity, and then kind of entered the BCG with this beautifully elegant solution. You could walk into a boardroom with the BCG and say, look, I don't need to know how a jet engine works. Just tell me its market share and the industry growth, and I will tell you what your strategy should be for it. With a single chart, executives suddenly felt like they had kind of X-ray vision into their entire portfolio, and they loved it. By 1979, nearly half of all Fortune 500 companies had adopted the matrix. It became this kind of unquestioned dogma. But as we all know, the business world doesn't stand still. And as the world moved into the 1980s, this kind of big, lumbering conglomerate model started falling apart. And critics realized the matrix had some fatal blind spots. The biggest criticism is what we call the snapshot problem. The matrix is entirely static. Think of it like taking a photograph of a high-speed train zooming past a station. That photograph gives you an incredibly sharp, perfect detail about exactly where the train is at that one specific millisecond. But it tells you nothing about how fast the train's moving or whether there's a collapsed bridge a mile down the track. The matrix assumes the market dynamics of today will be exactly the same market dynamics next year. And beyond just being this kind of static snapshot, it also fundamentally oversimplifies how profitability works. The entire x-axis relies on the assumption that high market share is the only path to high profit margins. Well, what about luxury goods? Think about high-end Swiss watchmakers like Rolex. They have a microscopically tiny market share compared to mass market brands making digital watches. Under a strict reading of the matrix, a Swiss watchmaker looks like a dog, but their profit margins are astronomical. So if you use the matrix to run a luxury brand, it would literally tell you to liquidate your most valuable assets, which is insane. And there's another massive blind spot. The matrix ignores synergies. We kind of hinted at this before. It treats every product as an island. Let's go back to Apple for a second. The Apple Watch might not be their biggest standalone profit driver, but it physically locks the user into the iOS ecosystem. If you buy the watch, chances are your next phone is going to be an iPhone. So if you blindly kill a dog like the Apple Watch that's secretly supporting your star, you've just shot yourself in the foot. And that brings us back to the Nokia story from the beginning. We got back there in the end. Nokia perfectly illustrates the ultimate failure of the matrix, its inability to handle rapid industry change. In the late 90s, as we talked about, Nokia's standard mobile phones were the undisputed stars that matured into what seemed to be untouchable cash cows. The matrix told them to aggressively protect the cow, harvest the profits, and maintain their lead in the mobile phone market. But what the matrix couldn't do is warn them that the very definition of a mobile phone was about to be destroyed. When Apple introduced the iPhone, they didn't just capture market share, they changed the game to smartphones, which was effectively a completely new market. Nokia was so focused on optimizing the supply chain for their existing cash cows that they viewed those early smartphones as risky, low share question marks. And by the time they realized that the question mark was a new reality, their cow was dead and they had no presence in the new market. So if this BCG framework is a static snapshot, it ignores synergies, it kind of hallucinates when it looks at luxury brands, and it blinded a tech giant to the biggest disruption in mobile history, why does it still show up in modern business strategy? How is this possibly usable in the 2020s and onwards? Well, it survives because its role has fundamentally changed. What do we mean by that? Well, in 1982, cash cows made up about 13% of all company products, while dogs sat at about 24%. The shift by 2012, well, cash cows had shrunk from 13% down to just 9%, and the dogs had ballooned to about 35%. So there's been this kind of ongoing massive explosion in low share, low growth businesses. Why did that happen? Well, it was the acceleration of technology and the internet. In the 1970s, barrier to entry were massive. Building a global supply chain took decades. Today, a startup can spin up global cloud infrastructure in an afternoon. It can source manufacturing overnight, and it can launch a global ad campaign on social media the next day. So the lifespan of a competitive advantage has just collapsed. The days where you can kind of build a cash cow and then just leisurely milk it for 20 years is for many industries over, because the market moves way too fast. So you can't use the BCG matrix as this rigid rule book anymore. Instead, you tend to use it as a framework for managing high-speed experiments. It's no longer about defending a static position, it's about agility. You have to constantly shift capital away from existing products and kind of aggressively throw it at these kind of unproven wild ideas, knowing that a lot of them will still fail. I mean, you can see this experimentation happening right now at the highest levels of tech companies. Look at Apple's relationship with artificial intelligence. For a long time, Apple was seen as a cautious, kind of almost hesitant adopter of generative AI, falling way behind Microsoft and Google. But recently, they made a massive pivot. They poached John Andrea, the head of Google's AI unit. They're pouring unbelievable rapid resources into their Apple Intelligence rollout. They're forging partnerships with other organizations to kind of fortify that. They aren't waiting for the AI market to settle down to see who the winners are. They're aggressively throwing billions at a question mark, trying to force it into a star, because they know if they wait, they'll get locked out of the next decade of technology. They're managing a dynamic portfolio, not a static one. The other twist nowadays is how we handle the dogs. Under the old matrix, you just kill the dog. But digital marketing allows for hyper-targeting, because you don't need a massive market share to be profitable if your customer acquisition cost is almost zero. Instead of wasting, a huge television ad budget on a low growth product, marketers can use platforms like LinkedIn to find the exact 10 professionals in the world who desperately need that niche dog product. You hit them with kind of laser focused messaging that is really cheap and manage to acquire them. So the matrix goes from being this kind of blunt executioner's axe to a scalpel. It's really helpful for helping you decide where you should target your resource allocation in real time, which fundamentally changes what this tool means if you're using it today in the real world. The matrix isn't this kind of magical oracle that spits out the guaranteed path to corporate success. Instead, it's a framework that forces you to honestly evaluate the reality of your resources. Whether you're running a massive company or you're managing a department or you're just trying to figure out where to spend your time and energy on a weekend side hustle, you have a portfolio. You have limited time, limited mental bandwidth, and limited cash. And what this grid cuts through the noise with and asks you point blank is, what are the tasks that are draining your energy and your wallet? Those are the dogs. What are the systems that quietly, reliably keep you afloat? Those are your cash cows. It imposes this kind of necessary discipline in an era of constant distraction. So to recap our journey through the corporate petting zoo that is the BCG matrix, We watched Bruce Henderson invent a desperately needed cheat sheet for kind of overwhelmed 1970s CEOs. We saw that cheat sheet become this kind of rigid dogma that led to the downfall of giants like Nokia. And finally, we've seen how if you kind of strip the rigidity out of the matrix, it can evolve into a more flexible framework that tries to show you exactly where you should be targeting your resources for kind of agile experimentation. The core concepts of critical thinking and resource allocation haven't really aged a day. It's just the markets now move infinitely faster than they did before. Now, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final interesting question known as consumer portfolio management or customer portfolio management. I want you to apply this to your own life right now. What if you completely stopped mapping your products or your tasks on this grid? And instead, you started mapping your clients, your customers, or even your professional relationships. Basically, think about the people you interact with daily. Who are your star clients? The ones that demand a ton of your attention and energy, but are actively fueling your growth, challenging you, and paying you large amounts of money. Who are your cash cow clients? The reliable, low maintenance accounts who pay their invoices on time every single month and never really raise a fuss. And crucially, who are your dog clients? The ones who constantly eat up all of your time with endless demands, offer no growth potential, and basically just make you lose your will to live. When you visualize your calendar mapped out on that grid, it kind of forces a very uncomfortable realization. Are you spending 60% of your week frantically trying to appease a dog when you should be out finding a new star? It's a hard question, but sometimes you need a really harsh framework to see your own life clearly. So the next time you find yourself kind of a bit overwhelmed, paralyzed by where to put your limited energy and resources, remember, sometimes the best way to understand high-level strategy is just to think about the good old-fashioned BCG Matrix. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategy Show. If you've enjoyed it or you found it useful, or hopefully both, please follow the podcast so you won't miss future episodes, and feel free to drop a comment on the episode. See you next time.